Hey guys, tonight we begin with the softest step you'll never hear. Not a gallop, not a sword, just the hush of cloth brushing stone. A breath that held its breath. A figure slipping sideways through a place meant for no one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Because tonight, we're not chasing glory. We're not storming castles or leading armies across moats of fire and fame. We're slipping through alleyways with someone who couldn't even admit who he was. Not a knight. Not a thief. Not a soldier. Just a man with a knife. A name he never spoke, and 1,000 regrets he never voiced. You've heard of assassins and stories cloaked in mystery, veiled in legend. But real ones, they didn't wear capes. They wore fear. And whatever kept them warm that night, maybe it was a patched wool tunic passed down from someone no longer alive. Maybe it was a borrowed hood that still smelled of another man's sweat. Maybe it was nothing but the heat of the task itself, the kind of warmth that flickers just once then goes out forever, and no one knew them. Because no one was supposed to. The best of them vanished into smoke. The rest just vanished. We'll walk softly through the dark places history tried not to write down, where names are erased, and the last words spoken were heard only by stone, from cloistered poisoners. To abandoned mercenaries, to women who stirred more than soup into the bowls of the doomed. This is a story about quiet endings, about lives lived beneath the floorboards of fame, about how death moved not with a roar, but with a whisper. So close your eyes if they feel heavy. We'll begin softly and sink into the shadows together, and that brings us to chapter 1. It always started with the chopping, not of limbs, not of heads, but onions, herbs, roots still damp with soil. The pantry was not a place for blood, not at first glance. It smelled of thyme and damp linen, of pickled beets and wooden shelves warmed by yesterday's bread. But deeper in the corners, past the baskets of garlic and the string-tied bundles of dried rosemary, something waited, a small vial, corked tightly, wrapped in cloth, hidden behind a sack of flour that no one had touched in weeks. The pantry never spoke, but it remembered everything. A poisoner didn't arrive wearing menace. She was small, quick, always slightly flushed from the stove. She hummed sometimes not songs, just fragments of breath to cover the sound of decisions. Because poison, you see, is a decision, not a weapon. It was never made in haste. It was brewed in silence, measured like a prayer, and unlike the blade, poison could whisper. It could wait. She stirred clockwise. 3 turns, then 2 the other way. Not because it mattered, but because she'd been taught that rhythm soothed the contents. Some said poisons could taste fear, could sense hesitation. She didn't believe it, but still she stirred the same way every time. Above her, the Lord's family laughed, or argued, or ate. Below, the scullery boys scrubbed pots with raw knuckles and cold wrists. But in the narrow space in between, she worked, quietly, carefully, and always alone, not because she wanted to be, but because anyone who stood too close might start asking why her hands shook before she added the parsley. There were rules. Never kill someone to high that draws eyes. Never kill someone to low no one pays. And never get caught at the market buying belladonna when you're supposed to be shopping for leeks. The thing about poison is it never looks like it belongs. Not on a table, not in a bowl, not in a cook's hand, but she belonged entirely. Because while they thought she was seasoning the stew, she was seasoning the end of someone's story. IT wasn't personal. It was the way things were. He was cruel. Or he was careless. Or he simply stood in someone's way. And she had debts. Or a child. Or memories that wouldn't stop waking her in the dark. Poison solved things without raising a voice. And in a world where women were told to keep quiet, poison was the only sentence. She could finish without being interrupted. Her apron was patched in 3 places. One of those patches had a hole behind it, perfect for slipping a thin packet through. It rustled sometimes when she walked, but no one ever noticed. The castle heard too many rustles, too many secrets that brushed past like mice and never left. A trail. The pantry had a door that creaked just once, near the top. If you pushed slowly, it wouldn't sound. She learned that the hard way. She learned everything the hard way. The first time she used the vial, her hands didn't shake. That surprised her. She thought they would. But they only trembled after, when the bowl was empty, and the man who emptied it was too quiet for too long. She didn't watch him die. She scrubbed the pot. Later, the steward said it was the meat, or the wine, or the weather. And she nodded, her hands still red from lemon and lie.no. One ever suspected the pantry.it was too small to dull. Just a place for storing onions, not sins, but the pantry knew, and she knew the pantry would keep its silence longer than any priest. You see, in a time when death was expected in childbirth, in battle, in bed, no one looked too closely at the spoon that fed it. There were nights when she sat alone, counting coins that didn't feel like hers. The fire would be low. The wind would move the shutters just enough to sound like breathing, and she would stare at her hands and wonder which part of her still belonged to herself. But in the morning, she'd boil water for porridge. She'd cut apples with the same knife she used to slice the roots. And she'd hum not a song, just a sound to keep her fingers steady. No one ever thanked her. Not the ones who hired her. Not the ones she spared. But then again, no one ever thanked the pantry either. And it held every secret she'd ever made. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Poison was never her weapon. It was her language, and the pantry, that was her church. She never prayed, but she always cleaned. He didn't speak to the blade, not like a soldier might, or a smith. He didn't name it, didn't bless it. He simply sharpened it again, and again, until his fingers grew calloused with habit, not reverence. The room was small, stone-walled, and too damp for comfort. The candlelight leaned and flickered, nervous in the draft that always came through the crack beneath the door. But the blade didn't care. It was iron, narrow, slightly curved, not for show, but for the soft slide it made beneath fabric, and between ribs the whetstone was old. Older than him, maybe. Smooth with time, gritty with repetition. He poured water into a cracked bowl, dipped the stone, and began the stroke. Scrape. Breathe. Scrape. Breathe. It was a rhythm. Almost holy. No thoughts. No names. Just the motion. He wasn't sharpening it to kill. Not yet. He was sharpening it because a dull blade made noise. And noise was the one thing he could never afford. In another life, this might have been a monk's room. There was a kind of stillness to it, like something inside had forgotten how to echo. The bed was a pile of straw that smelled of mold and sweat. The only decoration was a small wooden cross that someone else had left nailed to the wall. He never touched it, but he never removed it either. The blade glinted dully in the candlelight. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to disappear quickly, cleanly, and without a sound. He wasn't proud of it. But pride had no place in that room. Only silence. Only steel. His hands were careful. Steady. One held the hilt, the other guided the edge. And in the small pauses between strokes, he listened not for footsteps, not for voices, but for his own breath. He was still alive. And for now, that was enough. Some nights, the blade would nick his thumb. A warning. A memory. He'd suck the blood and keep going. Pain didn't frighten him anymore. Mistakes did. The wet stone rasped like a whisper dragged across gravel.it. Was almost comforting. Outside, someone might be laughing, or arguing, or dying. He wouldn't know. His world was four walls, one flame, and the knife that had kept him nameless for too long. He never asked who the target was until the morning. Not out of ethics, he had none left, but because names had a way of lingering. And lingering. Things made the blade heavy in his hand. He liked it light, easier to carry. Easier to forget. There was a leather strip nailed to the underside of the table. For polishing. For finishing. He pulled it taut and slid the blade along its length, stroking a memory back into silence. He wondered sometimes what his mother would say. If she'd recognize the boy who used to beg for stories by the fire. Or if she'd see the man and just close the door. He didn't blame her. The blade made a soft, satisfied sound as he turned it over. Not done. Never done. He slept beside it. Not out of paranoia that wore off after the first winter, but because he'd grown used to it. Its weight. Its presence. The way it hummed without sound when the job was near. He didn't write letters. Didn't keep mementos. He had one extra shirt and a pair of boots with soles that had seen too many miles, and the blade, always the blade dot in dreams, he never used it. He only carried it. He ran, always barefoot, always breathless, through long corridors with no doors. And when he woke, sweating and hollow, he'd reach for the hilt just to feel something that hadn't left him yet. The edge was sharp enough now. It could split cloth like breath. It could find the soft space behind the ear, or beneath the ribs, or just under the chin, where silence lives. He wiped it down with the corner of his sleeve, folded it into a sheath lined with oilcloth, and placed it beneath his pillow. The candle had almost gone out. Tomorrow. He would walk to the chapel steps and collect a coin from a man whose name he wouldn't ask, and then he'd sharpen the blade again. Because even when it wasn't used, it still got dull. Just like him, he never asked too many questions, not because he was disinterested, but because the silence between sins was often louder than the sins themselves. He was a confessor. But not the kind whose name you'd remember. No one requested him by name. They were sent to him, quietly. At dusk, his cell was no more than a hollow behind the chapel. Cold stone, thatch roof. A single wooden stool for himself, and one for whoever needed forgiveness. Forgiveness, that strange currency that never stayed in the pocket long. There was always a candle lit, even in daylight. Not for trauma, just for warmth. The stone never softened. No matter how long he sat, they came to him in cloaks, in silence, sometimes with eyes downcast, sometimes with eyes too steady, like they'd already decided not to hear the absolution. He knew the rhythm by now. A pause, a shifting of weight, then the voice not quite trembling, but not steady either. I have done something, they'd say. Or I was paid, or he deserved it. Rarely a name, rarely a date. Just the shape of a shadow laid softly. Between them, if you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. He didn't write anything down. He wasn't allowed. And even if he could have, what would he write? Tall. Man. smelled of horses. Voice like gravel, confessed to slipping something into stew. Mentioned they didn't explain further, and always asked not for forgiveness, but for forgetting. But forgetting wasn't part of the job. He was meant to remember just long enough to hand the guilt back as something. Lighter.so he listened, with hands folded, head tilted slightly, eyes somewhere near the candle, but not on it. Once, a woman confessed in the middle of a thunderstorm. She spoke so softly that he had to lean forward to catch the edges of her words. She had carried poison in a ring, a gift from someone whose name she never said. It wasn't mine, she whispered, but it felt like it was meant for me. He didn't answer. Not right away. He just nodded and let the silence do the work. After a while, people stopped confessing. They just sat, and he understood, sometimes. The burden wasn't what they did. It was what they were still afraid they might do, the blade that hadn't been used yet. The vial still full. The man still alive, but not for long. He never judged. Not because he was kind, though he tried to be, but because the chapel was old, and he had heard worse. One winter, a man came every night for a week, said nothing. The first for nights. On the 5th, he wept. On the 6th, he brought bread. On the 7th, he asked, if I do it, will I still be me? The monk didn't answer. He just lit another candle and slid it across the floor. There were days when he questioned it all. The robe, the rules. The silent archive of horrors passed like soft secrets through lips too dry to tremble. He sometimes wondered if forgiveness was even his to give, or if he was just the last stone they stepped on before crossing a river they never intended to return from. And yet, he stayed, not because he believed in redemption, but because someone had to be the last one to listen. He carried their words like small stones in his sleeves, heavy when wet, invisible when dry, but always there. He aged quickly, not in body, but in presence. His eyes lost the shine of questions and settled into the stillness of knowing too much. He prayed, but not for them. He prayed for the silence not to break, for the blade not to follow, for the door to always open inward, never kicked from without. He dreamt of voices without faces, hands stained red that didn't reach for help, rooms that smelled of ash and regret. But in the morning, he wiped the stool clean, lit the candle, and waited. He never asked who sent them. He never asked who died, but some nights, as he washed his hands in cold water, he wondered if the basin would ever overflow with what he'd heard. The parchment was thin. Too thin, really. It crinkled if you breathed too hard, and curled if left. Too close to the fire. But still it held power, not because of what it said, but because of who dared to write it. In a small chamber tucked behind a chapel wall where rats slept beneath old hymnals and candles gave off more smoke than light, a man dipped his quill into a dark ink pot and exhaled. Just once. He did not sigh. He did not frown. He simply released the breath he had been holding since the last letter. The tip of the quill was blunt from overuse. The ink stained his fingers purple-black, a mark that never quite left, no matter how often he scrubbed with lye and sand. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't even a clerk. He was a scribe, but not the kind who copied psalms or decorated capital letters with vines and birds. His letters were not meant to be beautiful. They were meant to disappear. Sometimes they bore names. Sometimes symbols. Sometimes nothing but a single phrase in a language barely spoken. But always, they meant the same thing. Someone would not be waking up tomorrow. He didn't know who. He never asked. The fewer the names, the safer the hands. The letters came to him folded, their instructions whispered or sealed. He was told only. The shape of the message, not its weight. His job was to give it legs to let it travel. Ink was lighter than blood, but not always safer. There was no wax seal, only a mark, a thumbprint in ash, pressed into the bottom corner like a quiet nod from someone who was already walking away. He'd been warned once, years ago. Never try to understand what you write. It's not for you, and he hadn't. Not really, but understanding doesn't always come from knowing. Sometimes it comes from repetition, from the way the same phrase shows up again and again like a bell that tolls just before dusk. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like. More nights like this. He kept the quill sharp, the parchment dry, his mouth closed. He'd moved 3 times in 5 years. Not because he was hunted, but because too many people began to recognize his handwriting. Once, a merchant's wife brought him a basket of pears. She said nothing, but her eyes said, "Thank you for what you made possible." He didn't eat the pears. Instead, he placed them one by one on the windowsill and let them rot. They were gone within days. The rats took them, or the birds, or time. He didn't care which. The letters never returned. They were passed by hand or coin to those who did not read but who knew exactly when and where to deliver. Sometimes he imagined the face of the one who would receive it. Not the assassin, but the one who would fall. He pictured them sitting down for supper, their last bite unknowingly halfway to the mouth. He imagined them whispering something kind just moments before everything changed. He didn't mean to picture these things, but ink had memory, and sometimes it dreamed. He never kept copies, never stored a scrap. Only the tips of his fingernails remembered, tinted just slightly too dark from writing in rooms where silence lingered long after he left. One evening, as he folded a letter along its crease, he felt something strange, a tremble, a hesitation in his wrist. He looked down and realized he had accidentally written his own name at the bottom. He burned the parchment before the ink dried. The smell haunted him for weeks. There was a word he sometimes wrote 3 letters, impossible to pronounce, but unmistakable in meaning. It didn't translate to kill. Not exactly. It meant something like unmake, or perhaps remove, as if never there. He always paused before writing it, not because of fear, but because, in that moment, he felt like a god with shaking hands. But he was no god, just a man with ink-stained fingers, a quiet chamber, and too many letters that no one should ever be proud of sending. It was supposed to be Wool. The man who sold it said so, swore on his dead wife's name. But wool didn't itch like this, and it didn't let the cold in so quickly. Still, it was a cloak, and that meant something. A cloak turned a face into a shadow, turned a body into a shape no one remembered. A cloak was armor, even if it was frayed at the seams. He pulled it tighter, not because it helped, but because it made him feel like he was doing something. The wind slipped under anyway, like a blade looking for the soft part beneath the ribs. He stood in a narrow alley between 2 stables. The ground was mud and straw, frozen into ruts by too many hooves. The air smelled of manure and iron and damp leather, but he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about how the hood drooped too low, how it blocked one eye unless he tilted his head just right, and how the clasp was broken, replaced with a bit of old twine that scratched at his throat every time he breathed. He couldn't afford a better one. Not yet. That was the irony. You had to kill to afford the cloak you needed to kill in, but he would manage. He always did. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The boots were worn thin. He'd stuffed straw inside to keep the cold from biting too hard. But the straw had gone flat hours ago. His target was late. Or maybe he was early. Or maybe this was a test. A trick he didn't know. He never knew. Timing was always a guess wrapped. Intention. His breath clouded in front of him, then vanished, just like he would. If all went well, he checked the blade beneath his belt. Still there, still silent. He didn't need to draw it yet. The kill wasn't the hard part. It was the waiting, the cold, slow unraveling of thought that came before the moment. He leaned against the wall. The stone was damp. His shoulder ached from an old fall. N01 had taught him this trade. There were no apprenticeships for silence, no guild for vanishing, only survival and the occasional whispered tip, passed in taverns or behind churches. Move at twilight. Don't run after. Don't look at their eyes. He had broken all 3 rules. More than once, and yet, here, he was in a cloak that didn't fit, in a life that didn't either. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. He thought of his mother sometimes. Not her face that had faded, but the way she used to tuck the blanket under his chin when winter winds rattled the shutters. There was no one to tuck him, and now only the wind, only the twine at his throat, only the blade he couldn't name. A dog barked in the distance. Hooves clicked against cobblestone. He flattened deeper into the shadow. People passed a woman with a basket, a man arguing with no one, a child skipping as if the world had no knives. He watched them go, and for a moment, he felt less like a man and more like the alley itself, cold, narrow, forgotten. The cloak slipped from one shoulder. He pulled it up again, shivering. The threadbare edge caught the nail of his thumb and tore it slightly. He didn't wince. Pain, like cold, was only loud if you let it be. Eventually, a figure turned the corner, tall, limping slightly, wrapped in fur that didn't sag at the edges. Not the target, just a merchant. Still, he watched. Because watching was survival too, the light began to change. Not darkness yet, but that soft, colorless hour between breath and exhale. He waited. The blade was warm against his side now. Not from heat, but from memory. He had used it before. Would use it again, but not tonight. Not yet. His name was gone. His story was quiet. And his cloak too short at the arms, too tight at the neck, was still the only thing between him and being seen. It didn't fit. But it was all he had, and sometimes that was enough. The room was not large. A table, a stool, a cot with a wool blanket that had once been gray, now stained with years of sleep and rainwater. The window was nailed shut, the door barred from within. There was no chimney, only a small hole in the ceiling where smoke escaped like a sigh. This was not a prison. It had no chains, no guards, no cries through iron bars, but still no one came out. He had chosen it. That was the strange part. He had walked in, alone, with a pack, a blade, and a letter no one else had seen, and then he locked the door. At first, he waited, listened, felt the walls close in like breath held too long. Then he unpacked. Not much. A flask of water, a loaf gone hard at the edges, a small cloth pouch filled with salt, and the letter folded, creased, and unread since the day he received it. He placed it on the table, flat, undisturbed, as if opening it again would turn silence into consequence. He did not sleep the first night. He counted the knots in the beams overhead. 37. Though one looked like a face, and he skipped it out of superstition. The fire he built was small, not for warmth, but for the illusion of control. Ash collected in the corners. Dust moved, like ghosts when he shifted on the stool. He wasn't sure what the letter said anymore, but he knew what it meant. Wait here. Do not leave. You will know when it's time. And so he waited. Day one was quiet. He watched the light crawl across the floor and wondered how long the wood had been rotting. Day 2, he rationed the bread. Day 3, he spoke aloud, not prayers, not memories, just words to prove his voice still worked. By the 4th day, the letter still lay unopened, flat, silent, like a second mouth, never speaking, but always watching. He dreamed that night of doors that opened into smaller rooms, and each smaller than the last. When he woke, he couldn't remember if the dream had ended. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. There was no schedule, no signal, only the slow sinking knowing that something was expected but not yet. A bird landed once on the sill, pecked at the glass, flew away. It felt like a question. He had no answer. He read the letter again on the 6th day. The words hadn't changed, but they seemed to echo differently now. Do not leave. Do not interfere. Do not be seen. If they come, you do not exist. Simple, terrifying. The blade remained sheathed, not out of peace, but because he had no target, no name, only the waiting. What does a man become when his purpose is to do nothing? He becomes still. He becomes hollow. He becomes the room. He learned to breathe with the floorboards, to time his meals by the movements of the sun, to listen for sounds that might not exist. On day 8, he heard footsteps, close, then gone. He did not check the door. He wanted to. His fingers twitched toward the latch, but the words in the letter rang louder than instinct. You do not exist. And so, he didn't. He sat. He stared. He slept in short, broken stretches. And 01 came again. The candle burned low. Wax dripped in patterns. He began to read like scripture. By the 10th day, he spoke to the table. Not out of madness, not yet, but out of loneliness, shaped like a man. He said simple things. I'm still here. It hasn't happened. I think the bread is turning green. The table never answered, but somehow its silence was softer than the letters. He tried to recall faces. His mother, a friend, a girl he once kissed beneath a freezing archway. They came in fragments, blurry, unreal. He pressed his fingers into the wood grain as if it might anchor him back to something real. By the 12th day, he knew. And 01 was coming, or if they were, it wouldn't matter anymore. His body had softened. His thoughts had thinned. The room had eaten his edges. He could leave. Now, the latch was still there. The key still turned, but he didn't, because the letter still lay on the table, because leaving meant being seen, because sometimes a room becomes safer than the world outside, and sometimes it becomes the only thing that still remembers your name. She wasn't supposed to be there, but that was the thing about children. They showed up in places grown men forgot to look, especially quiet ones. She was 12, or maybe 11. No one had marked her birthday in years. She moved like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. A wisp with feet, a whisper wrapped in second-hand linen. She wasn't hiding, not exactly. She had just found a place to sit, behind the rain barrels beneath the slant of an overhanging roof. It smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke. She liked that. Sometimes she came here just to listen. 2 people, 2 pigeons, 2 secrets they didn't know they were dropping. She wasn't eavesdropping, but she heard everything. That night, the light changed early. The clouds turned heavy before the bells. It would rain soon. She could tell. She curled her legs under her and watched the alley. Nothing moved. Not at first. Then him. A man, not tall, not short, wrapped in something brown that didn't quite match. He didn't walk like most men. He moved like he didn't. Want to be remembered, that was how she noticed. She always noticed the ones who tried not to be seen. She watched him pause near the butcher's shed. He looked once over his shoulder. Then he stepped behind the door that never quite shut properly. She waited, counted slowly to 10, then crept forward, just enough to see what she saw wasn't much. A hand, a glint, a shape slumped against the wall. No sound, only her heartbeat. In her ears, louder than anything else. She didn't scream, didn't gasp. She pulled her knees to her chest and waited for him to leave. When he did, he looked the other way, never saw her. Not even a flicker, but she saw him, and that was the problem. Afterward, she didn't run, didn't tell. She walked home through the puddles with a hollow where her stomach should have been. She fed the goats, washed her hands twice, ate stew without tasting it. She didn't sleep, not that night, not the next. She saw his face when she blinked. Not the whole face, just the edge of a jaw, a line where the hood met skin. Enough. She didn't speak of it to anyone, but her silence changed shape. Before, it had been comfortable, a blanket made of routine. Now, it was tight, sharp at the corners, full of questions she couldn't ask and wouldn't answer. Her mother noticed, asked if she felt ill. She shook her head, that was all, but from then on, she didn't sit behind the barrels anymore. She sat closer to the house, closer to firelight, closer to voices that didn't whisper things sharp enough to cut. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. A week passed. Then 2. The memory didn't fade. She watched every stranger twice. Not because she thought he'd return, but because now she knew they could be anywhere. She noticed which men wore hoods, which ones walked too quietly, which ones never looked children in the eye. One night, her brother found her staring at a knife on the table, just staring, not touching. She told him it was nothing, but the look never left her. Years later, when someone asked her what she remembered most about her childhood, she said, the sound of something that should have made noise, but didn't. Because that was the part that haunted her, not the blade, not the body, not even the man. It was the silence that walked like a person and vanished without ever making a sound. She never told anyone. Not then, not ever, but from that day on, she listened harder. Not for words, but for what people weren't saying. And sometimes, when the air grew too still and her skin prickled for no reason, she would wonder, did he know? Had he seen her even for a moment? Had he spared her, or simply missed her? The thought was worse than any answer, because in that silence, he left something behind, and it lived in her longer than the memory ever did. He gave the name Tomas, simple, unassuming, a name that fit beneath a hat and behind a shadow. It wasn't his, not even close, but it was one he'd used before. And in a town this small, names were more about manners than meaning. He arrived just before dusk, boots muddy, cloak wet, eyes soft around the edges. Like someone who had been walking too long in silence. The village wasn't much. A road that split between chapel and tavern. A well that groaned when the rope pulled dry. A dozen roofs too low and too patched to stop rain from finding a way in. He didn't mind. Rain was better than questions. At the tavern, he asked for stew. They gave him bread, cold. He didn't complain. He sat near the hearth, not too close, just enough to feel the heat, but not enough to invite a conversation. Around him, the regulars spoke softly about oxen, roofs, the wind shifting east again. No one asked why his hands were rough in a way that didn't match the mud on his boots. or why he kept glancing at the door even when no one entered. He sipped his water, tore the bread slowly. It tasted of yesterday. A boy with ginger hair watched him from the bar. Not bold, just curious. The way children look at dogs with one ear. Torn, not afraid, just unsure if they can be trusted. He gave the boy a nod. Didn't smile. Smiling made things stick when the innkeeper asked for his name to mark the ledger. He said, Tomas, again, wrote it himself. Quickly, with his left hand so the writing would look different if someone ever compared. It was the third time this month he'd been Tomas, but the first time he felt the name not settle. The woman at the next table furrowed her brow. Not at him, just at the sound of it. Tomas, she repeated softly, as if turning the syllables over in her mouth. He kept eating. As if he hadn't heard, she said nothing more. But her silence tightened the room just enough for him to notice. He slept that night in a corner room above the tavern. The kind with a slanted ceiling and straw mattress. The kind where nothing creaked loudly enough to wake anyone, except him. He slept lightly. Always, he dreamt of a man calling him by a different name, and of a crowd turning slowly in his direction. When he woke, his hands were curled into fists beneath the blanket. The next morning, he left early, didn't wait for bread, didn't look for the boy, didn't ask the weather. He walked until the village was a memory, and the memory began to reshape itself into something easier to carry. But that name, Tomasidich, now, like a thread pulled too many times, starting to unravel. He had others. Dozens. But each one felt a little thinner than the last. A name only protects you if no one repeats it too slowly. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing. Only if it feels right. He made it to the next town by nightfall. This one had a gate. A man with a spear. A woman selling eggs near a smoky torch. They asked his business. He said, messenger, then hesitated just half a beat before giving the next name. It wasn't Tomas this time. He let that one rest, but the pause stayed with him, like a bruise forming where no one had touched him. He checked the blade on his hip. Still there. Still silent, but the danger wasn't steel. It was a single syllable spoken by someone who remembered too well, or not quite enough. Names weren't just lies. They were decisions. Ones you had to live with or vanish beneath. And cold bread in a warm tavern? That was the closest thing to safety. He would know for a while. He lay still, not asleep. Just still, the kind of stillness that comes after too many nights listening for footsteps that never came but could. The room was dark, but not dark enough. A crack in the shutter let in moonlight, thin and silver, like something made of bone. It landed across his boots, the ones he hadn't taken off in 2 days. The bed beneath him was straw, but it felt like stones. Every shift made the silence itch. Sleep wasn't rest anymore. Sleep was a risk. You couldn't control what you dreamed. And worse, you couldn't control what you muttered when the dreams came. So he stayed awake, or close enough to it. Sometimes his body drifted, but his ears never stopped listening. The rat under the floorboards, the creak of wind in the shutters, the neighbors' cough to rooms over. He catalogued them like sins, one by one in order, until the night passed into something he could walk through again. He remembered when sleep had been easy, back before his name stopped being his, before doors had to be wedged shut with furniture, before he began checking the weight of coins not by their value, but by what they might have paid for. Now he lay with one eye open, not literally, but close. His knife slept beside him. If blades slept. It was wrapped in cloth, not for protection, but so it wouldn't make a sound when he picked it up in the dark. He had learned that the hard way. The job had been loud. Too much shouting. Too much blood. When he got back to the inn, someone knocked the mug from his table. He flinched, reached for the knife. Too fast. The scraping metal had been louder than the scream. Since then, cloth. Always cloth. The room smelled of smoke and wool. And fear, not fresh fear. Not panic. The old kind, the one that settles in your bones and only stirs when you close your eyes too long. He had seen what happened to the ones who slept too deeply. You woke with someone else's hands on your chest. Or not at all. So he didn't sleep. Not. Really. He waited, and when his body gave in, he drifted like someone trying not to be noticed by his own mind. Dreams came. But not like stories. They came like warnings. Broken images. A boot on stone. A window to open. A voice calling him by a name he didn't use anymore. He woke in sweat. Always, even in winter, and when he did, he lay still again. Heart racing. Breath caught between the ghost of a scream and the whisper of survival. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some nights he would walk, not far, just around the edge of town. Enough to remind his body that it was real. He counted steps, watched how shadows bent, noticed which houses had candlelight still flickering behind shutters. He liked those. Someone awake, someone else not sleeping. It made him feel less alone, but he never stayed long. Never let his silhouette linger in one place. Assassins don't sleep, because sleep means time. And time is where doubt lives. What if you were wrong? What if someone saw? What if they speak your name to someone who knows what it means? Better not to think. Better not to rest. He used to try reading. Used to carry a book, not for knowledge, but for quiet. But the words began to blur with faces, and the pages began to feel like confessions. So he stopped. Now he just listens. To walls. To wind. To the silence inside his own ribs. He knows someday he'll sleep. For real. The long sleep, and maybe it will be warm. Maybe not, but until then, he stays somewhere between closed eyes and open danger, because assassins don't sleep. They wait. They vanish. And in between, they listen to the dark. He had the look of someone who had done the job too long, not tired, not old, just heavy. Like each step he took carried the weight of what came before it. The executioner wasn't always a cruel man. He wasn't even a loud one. Most who met him in passing wouldn't have guessed. He had kind eyes, broad shoulders, and a quiet way of folding his hands when he wasn't working. But he was always working, even when the axe was hanging, even when his apron was clean, because once you're known for taking heads, you don't get to be someone else. You're the end, the last thing they see, the final silence in a world full of noise. He didn't mind the killing at first. It was a trade like any other, but trades wear out, and one day, you look down at your hands and realize they've become tools for something you no longer believe in. He started dreaming strange dreams of faces that didn't accuse him, just watched. Soft eyes, silent mouths, waiting for something he couldn't give. He began washing his hands more than usual. Even when they were clean, he stopped wearing the hood between jobs. And one morning, when the wind smelled like ash and wet hay, he decided he wouldn't do it anymore. And no speeches. No drama. Just a quiet decision, folded like a letter and kept in his chest. But leaving isn't simple. Not for someone like him. The town needed him. Even if they looked away when he walked past, they needed the ritual, the certainty, the way he held the axe like it wasn't personal. So he asked. Once spoke to a man in a red cloak with a gold ring. Asked to step away. The man said no, said it gently, like a friend refusing a favor. "You're too valuable," he said. "There's no replacement." That night, the executioner sharpened the blade. Not to use, but because the rhythm still soothed him, and he thought, maybe there's another way. A way out that didn't involve running or fighting. Just fading. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. He began writing letters. Not many, just one or two. Left in places only certain people would know to look. They weren't confessions. More like invitations, a way to trade his place for something quieter, something far from the square, far from the axe, far from the sound the crowd made when the job was done, and someone answered, not with a name, not with a face, just a sealed envelope tucked beneath his door, inside. A location, a time, and a final line, "Bring nothing but your hands." He followed the instructions. Met the contact, a man whose face was ordinary in a forgettable way. The deal was made. One last job. Not a beheading, not a public display, just one death. Quiet. Necessary. He didn't ask why. He just asked for the location he'd be sent to after. The man smiled. Didn't answer, but handed him a new cloak and a coin with no markings. The job went quickly. The body vanished, and the executioner left the axe behind. He walked away, not fast, not looking over his shoulder, just walked. He reached the village 3 days later. It wasn't on any map, and no one asked questions. They needed a miller. He said he knew grain. No one checked. He wore gloves now. Always, his hands were still steady. But they no longer smelled like iron-dotted tea night. He sometimes dreamed of wood blocks and blades. But in the morning, he ground flour. The townsfolk said he was quiet, kind, good with measurements. They never asked where he came from, and he never offered. Some lives don't end in fire. Some just slip softly into still water and never ripple again. They found it by accident. The cellar was part of an old house on the edge of town, one of those places that always seemed colder than it should be, even in summer. And no one had lived there in years. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Moss crept through the stone like slow handwriting. The windows were dark, but not broken, just forgotten. They were going to tear it down, clear the space, build something new. But when the workmen opened the cellar door, they paused. The air inside was still, not musty, not rotten, just still, like breath that had been held for too long. They went down with a lantern. Dust spun in slow spirals as they stepped. The room was small, damp, empty. Almost on the floor, someone had scratched something into the dirt, not carved, not inked, just dragged into the ground with a fingertip, or maybe a nail. The words weren't clear. Some had faded, others overlapped, but a few stood out, simple phrases. He asked me. It was not the first. I waited. I am still waiting. They read like a whisper given shape, like someone had needed to speak, but didn't trust the air to carry it. There was no name, no signature, no sign of who had written them, only a blanket, still tucked neatly in one corner, and a cup, long dry. Someone had lived here, or not lived. Waited, that was the word that echoed. Waited, but for what? There were theories. A runaway, a criminal hiding from the news, a woman cast out, a man too afraid to leave. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The villagers whispered stories because they needed the house to mean something, but the truth that quiet, Heavy thing that settles beneath the floorboards never made itself known. What they didn't know was that this cellar had once been offered in secret to those who needed to vanish. A man long dead now used to own the house. He had no family. But he had a reputation for letting people stay beneath his roof if they arrived with no questions and left without a trace. Not many did. Some simply stayed, and one of them, whoever they were, left behind these words, scratched in soft dirt. Not to be found, but not to be lost either. The phrases weren't confessions, not exactly. They were memories. Pressed into the earth like footprints in snow, a final proof that they had existed. That their waiting had meant something, even if no one knew what, and maybe that was the point. To leave a message that would outlast the mouth that spoke. To write something the rain could not wash away, not because it was strong, but because it was still. Stillness has its own kind of permanence. And no one lived in the house again. The workers left it standing, not because of fear, but out of respect. Some places are meant to remain undisturbed. A man came once. Years later, middle-aged, carried a lantern of his own. He didn't speak, just walked down the steps, stood by the markings and nodded. Then he left. He didn't write anything, but he wiped the dirt smooth with his palm before he climbed the stairs. Some confessions don't need to be read. Only remembered when he died. She didn't weep, not because she didn't love him, but because grief wasn't loud in her house. It was quiet. Like everything else, the neighbors whispered that she had seen too much, that she had known what he was. That maybe she was part of it, but they didn't say these things to her face. They only brought bread, left it on the doorstep, and knocked twice. She swept the floor the next morning, fed the chickens, poured tea. She didn't wear black. She wasn't mourning him the way they expected. Instead, that night, she stripped the bed, shook out the sheets, and placed the knife beneath her pillow. It wasn't ornate, just iron, plain, handle worn from the way his hand used to grip it low, near the guard. She didn't put it there out of fear. There was no one coming. She knew that. She put it there because it was his, and because part of her couldn't sleep. Without knowing something sharp was nearby, they had never spoken about what he did. He came home with mud on his boots, coins that didn't clink the same as local silver, and a silence that stretched long across the table. She never asked. She only set the bowl in front of him, waited, listened to his breathing, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but never easy. He was always tired, always watching something she couldn't see, but he was kind. He fixed the roof before the storms. He wrapped her hands in cloth when the cooking fire bit her. He never raised his voice, not once. He just carried the blade, and whatever came with it. And when he stopped coming home late, when the mornings stretched into empty afternoons, when the boots by the door gathered dust, she knew, and so she swept the floor, lit the lamp, and placed the knife where her cheek met the pillow. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. She didn't dream much. Or maybe she did, but the dreams were made of rooms and footsteps and the sound of a kettle just before it whistles. She kept the knife under the pillow for 7 nights. On the 8th, she sharpened it, not because she planned to use it, but because that's what he would have done, because dull things decay. And she didn't want the blade to forget its purpose, even if it was never called upon again. She kept his cloak in a chest, the one with the hidden latch. She never opened it, but every time she walked past it, her breath caught, not in pain, not in sadness, in recognition of something she had held without fully knowing. She thought about what they never said to each other, and how sometimes silence can be more loyal than truth. The knife was still cold when she touched it, no matter how long it had been there, and in the dark, it reminded her of him, not the man he was to the world, but the man who stirred the stew and kissed her wrist when he thought she was still asleep. One morning, she rose early, tied her hair back, brushed the dust from the windowsill, and wrapped the blade in cloth. She buried it at the edge of the garden, 3 steps from the apple tree, where he used to sit in late summer and peel the fruit in one long ribbon. She marked the spot with nothing, because the blade was not a monument. It was a memory, and memories, when sharp, cut best when hidden. He never explained it, not once. And no one ever asked either, because there are some things about men like him that you learn not to question before every job. He'd take a small clay cup chipped at the lip and pour in just enough milk to coat the bottom. Then he'd place a candle in it, light it, watch. That was all. Milk and flame, soft and sharp, held together in a silence thick enough to swallow your name. It wasn't for luck. He didn't believe in luck, but he believed in rhythm, in the kind of habits that kept your hands steady and your heart from wandering. The milk came from a farmer 3 miles out, always fresh, always paid for in coin, not questions. The candles were thin, made of tallow. He trimmed the wick himself, always the same length. And no words were spoken. And no prayers whispered, just the soft flare of light reflected in the curved wall of a cup meant for drinking, not watching. He'd sit by the flame until it settled, until it no longer flickered like it was unsure of its own purpose. Only then would he leave. The ritual had begun as a mistake. Years ago, he had knocked over a candle while drinking from the same cup. The milk snuffed the flame with a hiss, and the sound startled him so much he couldn't stop thinking about it. He didn't sleep that night, but the job went cleanly. No noise, no chase, no witness. So he did it again the next time, and the time after that. Soon it became the only part of the job that didn't blur. Everything else, the faces, the streets, the names spoken in half breaths, faded, but the milk stayed cold. And the flame always bent left. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Once, during a storm, he couldn't find milk. The farmer was gone, the cow sick, no one else nearby. He used water instead. The flame sputtered, danced, then went out without warning. That night, the job went sideways. Too many people in the wrong place. A dog that barked. A door that didn't open fast enough. He made it out, but not clean. He returned with a gash on his leg and 3 fewer coins than promised. After that, he never missed again, even if it meant stealing the milk. Even if it meant walking 2 hours in rain that bit through wool, because the ritual wasn't about milk. It was about order, about telling the chaos where to stand. The candle in the cup reminded him that there were still things he could control, even if they were small, even if they were meaningless. The world could burn, but in that one corner, light and milk would share space without asking why. He didn't tell the others, not the man who passed him names, not the woman who stitched his shoulder once after a blade kissed too close, not even the boy who once carried a message for him across town, eyes too wide for the weight of what they held. It was his alone, a flame, a cup, a reason not to forget who he was before the names, before the blade, before the soft, creeping guilt that lived behind the eyes and never quite closed. Years later, in a town he couldn't pronounce, he reached for the cup and found it broken, a crack all the way down, splitting the curve like a wound that couldn't be wrapped. He tried to mend it, failed. He used a different cup that night. The flame leaned right. He didn't leave. The job waited. But he didn't, because sometimes a man knows when the thing that holds him together has finally let go, and a flame in the wrong cup isn't just a superstition. It's a goodbye dot. It was just a doorway, narrow, crooked at the top, the wood swollen from years of rain and breath and silence. It leaned ever so slightly to the left, as if even it had grown tired of what passed through on one side. Candlelight, silver trays, boots polished until they gleamed like cold smiles on the other stone floors, threadbare cloaks, a pot that never quite came to a full boil. This was the door the servants used. A shortcut, a forgotten hinge between two worlds that were never meant to touch, but it whispered, not in words. In feeling, you could stand there right at the edge and feel the pressure of two lives brushing past one another without ever turning to meet. And that's where he stood, a man in shadow. Not yet a killer. Not yet anything. Just thinking. The hallway behind him was damp. The walls carried the scent of lye and old bread. The air ahead smelled like rosewater and brass. He had the blade tucked just beneath the hem of his cloak, wrapped in linen so it wouldn't clink when he breathed too hard. The name had been spoken to him the night before, whispered across a table so quietly he almost asked them to repeat it, but he didn't. He never did. Now here he stood, at the threshold, one foot still his, the other already not. The door didn't creak. Not tonight. It just held its breath, like him. He leaned closer. Not through, not yet, just enough to hear the voices on the other side. Laughter. Glass. A harp, maybe. Or a voice like one dot and no mention of fear. No expectation of blood. That made it harder. Killing a man who expected it, that was easier. This was something else. He had memorized the steps, where the shadows would fall, how to move when the firelight turned its back, but he hadn't accounted for this moment, this quiet hesitation, where a man wonders if the door is truly a door, or a test. He placed his hand on the frame. It was warm, not from fire, from life, from all the people who had touched it without thinking. A girl carrying soup, a boy with muddy shoes, a maid brushing tears from her cheek as she passed through without being seen. He could almost hear them, and for a moment, he felt like he was trespassing on something older than the job. He stepped back just once. The faintest shift, but it was enough for the blade to press lightly against his hip, as if to ask, "Are you still sure?" He didn't answer. Not out loud, but his breath steadied. His foot returned to the line and the door. It whispered again. Not a word. Just possibility. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. He never wrote about that night, never spoke of it, never said whether he crossed the line, whether the blade found its home, or whether it was sheathed and forgotten beneath the moonlight. But afterward, he stopped taking jobs in houses with doorways like that, too narrow, too human. He preferred open fields, stone corridors, places where walls didn't breathe and doors didn't remember your weight. Years later, a servant girl told someone she'd once seen a man by the threshold, a shadow who never came through. She said she wasn't afraid, only curious, because the door had made a sound that night, not a creak, not a groan, something softer. As if it were trying to stop him. He was no one, not in the poetic sense, not some wandering soul searching for meaning, just a man, quiet, unremarkable, the kind who worked with his hands, ate with his sleeves rolled up, and nodded more than he spoke. He lived alone. Had a dog once. Buried it behind the shed with a cross made from fencewood and rusted nails. His neighbors knew him, but only in the way you know the shape of a tree from a window familiar, but never touched. Then one night, someone knocked on his door. He didn't answer. not because of fear, but because it was too late for visitors and too early for mercy. The knock came again, then silence. He stood behind the door for an hour, bare feet on cold stone, holding a breath that seemed to have nowhere to go. Eventually, he returned to bed, but something had shifted. The next day, he heard the news. A man had been found dead, alone, and face down in the river that split the woods from the fields. Wrong clothes. No shoes. Knife wound high on the spine. No name. Only a description, and it matched his too closely. Same height, same beard, same old coat with the crooked stitching on the shoulder. Only it wasn't him, but they thought it was, and for a few hours he was a ghost watching his own shadow. It would have been a strange story if it had ended there, but it didn't, because when someone is meant to die, and they don't, the world doesn't always adjust politely. Someone comes looking, not to apologize, but to finish. He saw it in the way the baker watched him when he passed too quietly. He heard it in the silence of the blacksmith who used to nod and didn't anymore, and in the eyes of a stranger who passed him in the lane and seemed surprised to see him still breathing. That night, he didn't sleep. He packed a sack. Simple things. A loaf, a blade, a strip of cloth wrapped around dried apples. The last letter from a friend now long buried. He didn't run. Not exactly. He just moved like fog down a slope, like someone walking backward without turning around. He took the long roads, spoke to no one, slept beside rivers. He knew how it worked. He wasn't the mark, but he'd been close enough to catch the shape of the shadow, and sometimes that's all it takes, because they don't check twice. They don't ask kindly. They remove what lingers, what threatens the neatness of their silence. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. In one village, he stayed long enough to earn coin for chopping wood. Didn't speak his name. Didn't stay past sundown, but the innkeeper had kind eyes and too many questions she didn't ask. She gave him a bowl of stew and a second blanket. He thanked her with a nod that held more than it said. Then he left. Why then? He'd grown used to the quiet, not the peaceful kind. The cautious kind, where every breath is weighed, where every glance is measured. He still didn't know who the dead man was. Never learned what they were meant to do. Never found out why his face had matched just closely enough to put him in the way. But sometimes the wrong man dies, and the right one runs, and both are punished. He never went home. Didn't write. Didn't try to correct the record, because records are for the living. And he wasn't entirely sure which side of that he belonged to anymore. Years later, a woman swore she saw him selling thread in a market 2 towns over. She said he had a limp and smiled like someone who knew he wasn't supposed to be seen. But by then, he was a story, a mistake, a loose thread no one had quite pulled tight, and he liked it that way. The table was already set, 12 plates, silver polished until it caught the candlelight like a secret, garnet red napkins folded into soft peaks, a bowl of figs in the center slightly too ripe, but no one minded. The feast was meant to celebrate. A treaty, a birth, a marriage between families that had once met only through messengers and apologies. The wine had been ordered weeks in advance. The bread baked with herbs not native to the region. Even the meat goose, not lamb, had been chosen for its extravagance. Everything mattered, every gesture, every seat, every hand placed gently over another in toast. But beneath all that ceremony, someone else had planned something quieter, something final. The assassin was scheduled, a man whose name was never spoken, whose arrival wasn't marked on parchment, or parchment's shadow. He'd received the message in a cellar, the kind where rats leave you alone because even they know when not to listen. A letter A coin. A whisper. He was to enter at the height of the third course. Between the stewed pears and the roast fennel, one man. Far seat. Laugh like a bark. A ring with 2 stones. That was all. He memorized the room from diagrams. Learned the steps not for dancing, but for walking without pause. Where the curtains pooled. Where the candles sputtered, the plan was precise. Not perfect plans never are, but tight enough to hold, and then something shifted, not loudly, not in panic, just enough. It began with the bread, late, then burned, the cook sent it. Back, again, the timing frayed, then the wind changed. The windows, usually shut tight before sundown, were left cracked to chase the smell of char. A servant tripped. Wine on the stone floor. A stain that wouldn't dry in time. So the guests were asked to wait 10 minutes. 15. They lingered in the courtyard, and that was enough, because he had already entered, moved through the shadows. Positioned. Poised, waiting for a cue that never came. He stood behind a velvet curtain longer than he ever had before. Sweat gathered at the base of his neck. Not from fear. From doubt, and doubt was worse, because now every second was too long. Every step he'd planned stretched and snapped. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The guests eventually entered. Late. Tense, the host argued with the steward under his breath. A woman laughed too loudly at nothing. A man sat in the wrong seat and refused to move, the ring with 2 stones. Absent. No explanation. No apology. Just. Not there. The assassin didn't move. Not for a while. He waded through the soup. Through the goose. Through the pears that never arrived. By the time dessert was served, his blade felt heavier than it should have. He left through the kitchens. No one noticed. Too busy scraping jam from silver spoons and pretending everything had gone as planned. But it hadn't. Not for him. Not for the man who never showed. Not for the host who would later learn that someone had been paid to make his celebration smaller by 1. The assassin returned to the cellar, left the coin. Said nothing. Sometimes a silence is loud enough to be heard by those who matter. They never found out why the man didn't come. Illness. Change of heart. A lover's warning whispered into the right ear just before the carriage arrived. In a 1. New, but after that night, the feasts grew smaller. Quieter. People spoke in half sentences. Laughed with eyes watching the corners of rooms, because something had been set in motion. And then paused, and that pause that invisible hand pulled back just before the strike was worse than the blow itself, because it meant someone had wanted it, planned it, paid for it, and maybe they still did. They found it during cleaning day, not on purpose, not with ceremony. Just a hand reaching through straw, searching for a dropped coin, and closing around something colder than it. Should have been. The girl pulled back with a gasp. She thought it was bone at first, but it was metal, dull, dark, and broken clean in half. A blade, hidden, buried beneath the bedding in a room where only children slept. The straw had shifted. The seasons had changed. But somehow it had stayed silent, waiting. The adults didn't know what to make of it. They asked questions no one could answer. Who put it there? When and why had it been broken? Not bent, snapped. A clean split near the hilt, as if something too strong had met something too fragile. The hilt was wrapped in what had once been red cloth, now brown, muddied by time, and something darker. They argued for a bit. Should it be thrown away? Buried? Given to the constable? But in the end, no one wanted to touch it again. A tea was left on the table near the stove for a day. Then forgotten, but not by everyone. The boy whose bed it had been he remembered, not the blade. Not exactly, but something, a dream maybe, from a year ago. Or longer, someone entering the room. A shape. A breath, too quiet to be his sister. Too cold to be the wind. He'd woken in the night to the scent of rain and leather, and when he looked no one was there. Just the sound of someone walking away very carefully on boards that creaked anyway. He hadn't told anyone. He'd buried the memory like children bury other strange things deep, beneath layers of sleep and soup and scraped knees. But now, the blade, and it all rushed back, a figure. A movement near the hearth. And the sense that someone had hidden something with the desperate calm of a man who doesn't have time to be careful. A tea hadn't been meant to stay. A tea had been meant to be retrieved, but no one ever returned. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The house had once belonged to a family that disappeared during winter, gone in a day, food still warm, fire still lit, door unlatched, as if someone had just stepped out. People said wolves, or sickness, or the kind of silence that arrives only after someone knocks and isn't let in. The new family moved in spring. They scrubbed the floors, hung herbs to chase the ghosts, filled the rooms with children and the sounds of bread being torn in half. But some things sink deeper than soap can reach, and a broken blade left behind in straw doesn't forget what it was meant for. The boy didn't tell his mother. He just stared at the table, at the thing that had shared his bed, and wondered what it had once done to deserve being buried in the place where he used to dream about sunlight. He began sleeping with his feet tucked up, as if afraid something else might rise from beneath the straw. Not sharp, not violent, just unfinished, because a broken blade isn't dangerous because of what it can do. It's dangerous because of what it couldn't. Someone had failed, or fled, or stopped short of something final. And now the blade was here, waiting to be remembered. They eventually threw it in the well. Not with a blessing, not with a curse, just a shrug. A final act of not wanting to be involved. The splash echoed, longer than it should have. After that, the dreams returned, not loud, not frequent, just now and then, of footsteps, of red cloth, of something sharp that once had a purpose, but no longer knew where it belonged. He arrived during Lent, which made it easier. The town was already quiet, already fasting, already looking inward, and when a man in priest's robes walks in, dust on his boots, voice soft from travel. No one thinks to ask where he came from. They welcomed him, fed him soup, gave him the old rectory with the leaky roof and the garden overrun by nettles. He said little, smiled just enough, nodded more often. Then he answered, and on Sundays, he stood in the pulpit and spoke in a voice that didn't rise, didn't tremble, just settled. He read the Psalms with the ease of someone who had never doubted a word, and when he placed his hand on your shoulder, you felt calm. Even if you didn't know why, but there were signs, small ones, like the way his eyes didn't close during prayer, or how he never quite bowed his head when blessing the bread. He never stumbled over scripture, but he never quoted it either, and no one ever saw him write, not a sermon, not a note, not even his name. The children were afraid of him. They said he smelled of stone, and that his shadow moved too slowly, but their mothers told them to hush, to be grateful, to be good, because he had come when they needed someone. And no one else had. It was the widows who noticed first how he never coughed, how the candle near his bedside never burned down, how the door to the rectory never creaked even though it always had. They whispered, of course, Because that's what people do when something holy feels too still. But no one dared say it out loud until the boy went missing. He'd been helping in the garden, pulling weeds. He liked the priest. Said he didn't talk too much and didn't ruffle his hair like the others did. One morning, he was just gone. And a note. No sign of struggle. Just his boots, left by the door, and a spade still stuck in the earth. They asked the priest. He frowned. Said the boy must have run away. Said he'd pray for his safe return, and then he lit a candle. A tall one. White wax. No scent, but some said they saw something in his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, just knowing. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. After that, he stopped preaching, said he needed time for reflection. Said silence was also a kind of prayer. People still brought him food, left it at the door, but fewer stayed to talk. The children wouldn't walk past the rectory after dusk. And the cat that used to sleep on the windowsill never came back. Then the dreams began. The butcher's wife saw the priest standing over her in her sleep, whispering words she didn't understand. The tanner said he heard his dead brother's voice coming from behind the chapel wall. And the widows, they stopped speaking altogether. 3 of them. One after the other, not from illness. Just quiet. As if something had taken the words right out of their mouths and folded them away for safekeeping. By the time midsummer arrived, no one spoke his name. They still left the bread, still nodded if they passed him near the well. But their eyes looked elsewhere, and still he stayed, until one night a light flickered behind the chapel. Not fire, not candle, a glow. Soft, blue. A shepherd saw it. And then did end single quotes T.by morning. The priest was gone. So was the boy's spade. So was the tall candle. The rectory door stood open, but the inside smelled of nothing. Not even dust. They never replaced him. The chapel sat empty for years. The garden swallowed itself. No one touched the bread left on the step, and whenever someone new asked what happened to the priest, the villagers just said he was kind, then walked away. The room had only one mirror. It wasn't large. Oval, rimmed in tarnished brass, hung at just the wrong height, too low for a tall man, too high for a child. It had cracked once, right down the center. A line like a scar, thin and quiet, cutting through the reflection, but not breaking it. He didn't remember when it cracked, only that it had always been cracked for as long as he'd lived in that room. And he'd never moved it. The room itself was spare. One bed, a stool, and a chest with a lock that had never worked. A window looked out at the wall of another house. Nothing but brick and shadow, day or night. He'd lived here for a year, maybe more. Time moved differently when you stopped being someone. He didn't use his real name anymore. Not aloud, not in thought. Names have a way of pulling the past back toward you, and he'd worked too hard to bury it. Each morning, he'd wash his face in cold water, not to feel awake, but to feel anything. And after, he'd look in the mirror, not for long, just a glance, just enough to make sure he still existed. The man looking back was always the same, tired, careful, waiting. But then, one morning, something changed. He looked into the mirror and didn't see himself. He saw a version of himself that looked finished, not older, not wounded, just done. The crack down the center had split his face into 2 halves, one side calm, the other he didn't know. He stared, longer than usual. The light from the window didn't reach him fully. The edges of the room blurred. Only the mirror remained clear and for a moment, he felt like he wasn't alone. As if the man in the mirror wasn't reflecting, but watching and waiting. He stepped back. The reflection did in single quotes it stayed, still, split, certain. He didn't scream, didn't run, just turned away. Slowly sat on the bed, breathed. He didn't look in the mirror again that day, or the day after, but the feeling stayed, a tightness in the chest. The knowledge that something had been seen that couldn't be unseen. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. At night, he began dreaming. Not of places but of mirrors, hallways lined with them, each showing a version of himself that he couldn't remember being, some younger, some thinner, one with blood on his collar, one smiling with a mouth he didn't recognize. He woke drenched in sweat, always facing the wall, as far from the mirror as he could manage. He considered covering it, tearing it down, but he didn't, because some part of him believed that if he broke it again, it would break him too. Then came the final day. It wasn't marked. Nothing dramatic. He simply stood before the mirror and looked, really looked, and this time, there was no reflection at all, not a trick of light, not fog on the glass, just emptiness. Where he should have been, there was nothing. He reached out, touched the glass. It was warm. That surprised him. He stepped back again. Slow, measured, still nothing. He sat on the stool, folded his hands, waited, because sometimes death doesn't come with sound. Sometimes it's not a blade or a fall or a gasp. Sometimes it's a quiet moment when the world no longer shows you who you are, and that's when you know. He died there. Not with blood, not with violence. He just went, and the mirror, it stayed, cracked, silent, still waiting. A new tenant moved in years later. They never hung anything on that wall, said the space didn't feel right, said they always felt watched. When they looked too long, they covered the mirror with a cloth and never removed it. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no crash of memory, no dramatic forgetting, just a slow unspooling, like thread slipping loose from the hem of a cloak. At first, it was small things, where he'd left the coin purse, what name he'd given in the last town, why he started eating with his left hand when his right was still. Fine, little things, things no one else would notice, but he did, because for a man like him, memory wasn't nostalgia. It was survival. You had to know where you came from, so you'd know what not to answer when asked. You had to remember the lies you told, and the truths you buried, and when the edges of those began to blur, so did he. He woke one morning in a cottage he didn't recognize, wearing clothes he didn't remember stitching, and staring into a fire he didn't recall lighting. There was no danger, no blood, no knock at the door, just the smell of baked oats, a broom leaning by the hearth, and silence, the kind of silence that didn't hide, the kind that simply stayed. He looked around. There were no maps, no weapons, just a chair, a bed, a pot, and something else. Peace, not safety, that was different. Peace, the kind you only feel when you no longer know what you're running from, that frightened him more than anything, because if he couldn't remember the threat, how would he see it coming? He stood slowly, hands testing the edges of the table, the corners of the room. A bird chirped outside. He didn't know its name, but the sound felt familiar. He stepped outside, fields, a path, a sky too wide to feel real. And no sign of who he'd been. And no trail of who he'd lost. And suddenly, it was easier to let go. He spent the day gathering firewood, didn't look over his shoulder, didn't count his steps, didn't sharpen a blade at dusk, because he didn't have one, not anymore. If you're enjoying this pace already, Leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. At night, he sat on the porch, watched stars, listened to the wind, wondered if anyone was still looking for him, and more strangely, if he would even recognize them now. What did they call him? He didn't know, not the names on the papers, not the ones whispered in taverns. The real one, the one he used before. He learned how to disappear. That name was gone, and in its place stillness. He stopped traveling, stayed. People passed sometimes, waved, said hello. He waved back. They asked where he was from. He smiled, said east, or the hills, or nowhere really, and they believed him. Because he did too, he grew herbs, fixed chairs, fed the birds, and slowly the muscles in his arms softened. The edge in his eyes dulled. The tension in his jaw faded. One day, a child wandered onto his porch, stared at him, asked, "Were you ever a soldier?" He thought, paused, then said, "Maybe." The child nodded, satisfied, and ran off. He watched the dust rise after her. That night, he dreamed of boots in snow, of a river with no bridge, of a whisper he didn't understand, but when he woke, it was morning again. Warm, simple, and the world didn't expect him to be anything other than what he was now, a man with no story, no past, only presence, and for the first time in a very long time. That was enough. She never asked him where the money came from, not once, even when it doubled, then tripled. Even when he bought her new boots, when her old ones were still good enough to patch, she just thanked him, quietly, and placed the coins in the tin beneath the floorboard next to the dried lavender and the letters she never sent. He was her boy. Still thought, and no matter what his hands had done or what they smelled of when he kissed her cheek and sat at her table, like he still belonged in the soft world. He didn't speak much. Not anymore, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of unsaid things. He'd once been a talker. As a child, he filled every silence with questions and whistling and stories about birds that weren't real. Now, he just said, "I brought bread," or "I won't stay long," and she would nod and stir the pot and ask if he wanted tea. He always did. She watched him eat like he was still growing, still hungry in a way she didn't know how to feed. He didn't look at her hands, because he remembered when they were used to cradle, not to tremble. He never brought friends, never laughed, but he always brought something, food, salt, a new shawl stitched by someone else's mother, who probably didn't know. She knew, of course she did. Mothers know these things. The same way they know when a fever is coming, or when a lie sits just behind the teeth, but knowing and naming are not the same thing. She never named it, because if she did, it might break something fragile and invisible that still held them together on opposite ends of a kitchen table. She remembered when he was small, when he scraped his knee chasing a goat to fast and cried because he thought he wasn't supposed to. She had kissed his cheek and said, "You're allowed to hurt." She wondered if anyone said that to him now. Probably not, if you're still settling. And maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. He stayed for an hour, sometimes less. He never slept there, not even when it rained. She offered. Every time, he declined. Every time, and she stopped, insisting, because some things are more painful inside four walls. He left the coins in the corner, under the chipped cup. Never handed them to her directly. As if giving them from his hand to hers would make it too real. He hugged her, like he was remembering how. And when he pulled away, he looked at the wall behind her, never her face. She waited until he was gone, then stood in the doorway watching the path until it bent and vanished into trees. She made tea, sat, and finally allowed herself to breathe out all the questions she would never ask. Where did he go? What did he carry? And how many times had he come home with blood behind his eyes and no place to put it? She knew not the details, not the names, but the shape of it, the shape of someone who had done things that made sleep feel dangerous. She began to light a candle for him. Not every night, just the ones when the wind felt heavy and the world seemed quieter than it should. She didn't pray for his soul. She prayed for his hands, that they would one day hold something gentle and remember how, and for his heart wherever. He had buried it. When the neighbors asked about him, she just smiled, said he worked far away, said he was kind, said nothing else, because a mother's love doesn't require the truth to remain whole. A tea just requires presence, and tea and a doorway, always left open just enough for him to find his way back when the weight gets too much. They found it at first thaw. A folded bit of parchment, curled like a sleeping hand, wedged into the frozen earth, just beside a stone that no longer bore a name. The grave itself had faded. Time had stolen the letters. Moss had crept across what was once sharp and sure. Now, it was just a marker of something once loved, or once feared, or once forgotten. The letter had no wax, no seal, just creases deep with weather and a corner darkened by soil and snow. Someone had placed it there not with ceremony, but with care. No one saw them do it. No one claimed to know when it was left, but it hadn't been there the day before. It wasn't addressed, not in any usual way, just 4 words written in a hand that had once known elegance. You're not wrong, that was all. And yet, it said everything. The villagers said little. Some shook their heads. Some crossed themselves, but most just stood a moment longer than they needed to, and then moved on. The grave belonged to no one now. Or perhaps to everyone. A legend? A criminal? A shadow that used to walk among them? No one agreed, but they all felt it, the gravity around that plot of land, like something unfinished, had finally softened. The frost hadn't yet released the earth, but the letter stayed pressed close to the stone, as if the words inside still needed to be heard. Perhaps it was from a brother, or a lover, or a name never spoken aloud, because it would have undone too many things. No one knew, but someone had carried it for years, carried it through rain, through border crossings, through silence, carried it in a shoe, or in the lining of a coat, or maybe just behind the ribs, folded tighter and tighter with every passing winter, until the time came to finally let it go, not as confession, not as closure, just as truth. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. It was read by many, but understood by none, because the words weren't for them. They were for the one beneath the soil, or for the version of him that still lived in the hands and memories of those he left behind. No name, no date, no explanation, just that single line. You're not wrong. It echoed louder than most sermons, because sometimes all a soul needs is not absolution, but acknowledgement. He had lived a life beneath silence, a life of shadows, of decisions made in hallways with no windows. People like that don't ask for forgiveness. They ask for someone, just one, to say, I understand, and the letter did. In that cold morning light, with the ground still stiff beneath frost, truth was delivered not to the living, but to the space that memory had left behind. They didn't move the letter. They let it stay, let the wind curl its edges, let the snow fall again, because some things don't need to be protected. They just need to be heard. He carried it every day, woke with it beside him, slept with it near the door, walked with it against his ribs like a second breath, but he never used it. Not once. The knife was always sheathed, wrapped in leather so worn it had grown soft, edges smoothed by years of handling, but never drawing dot. It wasn't because he couldn't. His hands were steady, his steps silent, his eyes sharp. Even in old age, he was trained. Taught in alleys and basements and long silences how to end things cleanly, and yet he didn't. People assumed he had. When they looked at him at the way he kept his back to the wall, at how his voice barely rose above a whisper, they thought, yes, he's done things, but they were wrong. He had only ever been a possibility, a man built to do what he never quite allowed himself to do. The offer had come when he was young. Too young, maybe, and at first it felt like purpose. A role to step into. A path with rules, even if those rules were made in blood and dust. He accepted, took the coin, took the code, took the blade, but when the time came the first time, he hesitated, a breath, a tremble, a choice made so quietly it didn't even register as rebellion. He didn't run, didn't confess, just returned, said nothing. No one asked, because silence in his world could mean anything. Could mean it was done, and so he was paid, and so it continued. The name was never spoken again. The target was assumed gone, and the blade still clean. The second time, the same, and then it became a rhythm. He showed up, listened, watched, and walked away. Sometimes he gave false reports. Other times, the target disappeared anyway by someone else's hand or fate's, and so he lived in the small space between belief and truth, a killer who had never killed, a man mistaken for a shadow who had never cast one. He aged into it, grew quieter, more deliberate. People left him alone, because men with knives are dangerous. But men with sheathed knives make people uneasy. You never know when. Or if. He never told anyone, not out of shame, but because it didn't matter. The fear was real. Even if the blade never tasted blood, the possibility had weight. That weight followed him into shops, into dreams, into the long stretches of evening where the fire dimmed and memory tried to rewrite itself. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. He had no children, no partner, just a room, a lamp, a knife that had never asked for anything except the chance to be what it was made to be. Sometimes he spoke to it, softly, at night, not like a man to his weapon, but like someone acknowledging the life he never lived. You're never needed. He once said, the blade said nothing. It never had. When his hands grew stiff, he stopped wearing it, wrapped it in linen, tied it with twine, placed it in a box beside a few coins, a worn book, and a stone with a hole through the middle, a token he'd kept since childhood. He left no note. No will, just the box, placed neatly on the shelf where the sun would touch it each morning. When the villagers came, those few who still noticed him enough to notice he hadn't been seen, they found everything in place. The fire had gone out. The tea was cold, and the knife sat untouched. Someone opened the box, held the blade. They expected something else. Weight, heat, a story, but it was just metal, wrapped in cloth, sharp but unused, a tool, but never applied. And that was the story, wasn't it? A man shaped by a future he never stepped into, a death dealer who left no bodies, a name whispered in warning, even though no one had been harmed. And perhaps that was the legacy, not fear, not silence, but restraint. A man who could have, but didn't, not because he was a coward, but because he carried a different kind of courage, the kind that waits, the kind that lives its entire life on the edge of a decision and never crosses, the kind that dies with clean hands, and that quietly, brings us to the end, a life lived in. Whispers, a blade that never sang. A story told not by its actions, but by the ones it chose not to take. Some knives are forgotten in drawers. Some are buried in backs. And some remain in their sheath until the hand holding them no longer needs to decide. Thank you for listening. Good night.